Hello everyone. Okay, I hope we're all well and happy. What I'm going to do in the lesson today is first of all talk about what I set you to do last lesson about Stolypin and the agricultural changes that took place under the reign of Nicholas II. So I'm going to go through all that a little tiny bit with you all, and then I'm going to set you up on the work of Stalin and Lenin and how they treated the peasants. And again, when we're doing this, you need to think about similarities and differences across the entire period. So when we talk about Stalin and Lenin, think about what is similar, what is different to what was done under the Tsars. So Stolypin, as I said last lesson, he became president of the Council of Ministers after 1905, and he wanted to make a number of reforms to Russian agriculture. And the reason, or the main reason why he did this, was to preserve autocracy. He argued, or he believed, that the peasants had some legitimate grievances and some perhaps less legitimate grievances, and what he wanted to do was make a series of reforms in order to ensure that the peasants were loyal to the Tsar and autocracy. So the big thing behind his reforms was to preserve autocracy. Again, a little bit similar to Alexander II, his idea about emancipating the serfs, again, was to try and preserve autocracy, wasn't it? So, the problems which were identified by Stolypin was food shortages. Obviously, there'd been the famine in the 1890s. He saw that food shortages were also a problem in terms of the Russian military, because obviously you need food to feed an army. Also, it was a problem for industrialisation because the cities obviously can't grow their own food, and therefore he was very keen that the peasantry should be able to grow more food. Um, He also was concerned about how the emancipation of the serfs had actually led to further problems. That stuff about them getting worse land and all those sorts of issues. It hadn't actually made their lives any better. And actually, one of the fears in 1905, when you had those uprisings, a lot of peasants feared that Nicholas was wanting to dispossess them of their land and have state control of the land again. And a third issue was having a population explosion in Russia in the late 19th century, i.e., lots more Russians. Therefore, again, that exacerbated the food shortage issue as well. So, what Stolypin does, his first thing he does in 1905 during those revolutions that took place, is he persuades Nicholas, who agrees, to cancel the redemptive payments. So that seems to quell one of those problems of the peasants had regarding life being made more difficult due to the emancipation. What he also did, he was also very strong. He was also very keen. He called it the wager of the strong, and his plan was to create a group of peasants who were perhaps a bit wealthier than most peasants, a bit more entrepreneurial, who would be utterly loyal to the Tsar as a consequence of this. So the Tsar gave us these freedoms. We've made money now from growing food. Therefore, isn't the Tsar and autocracy wonderful? And so what he does is he establishes a land bank. And the idea of this is that more entrepreneurial peasants, for want of a better phrase, they could borrow money from this land bank at a fairly low rate to buy up more land. So if you were a slightly richer peasant, for circumstance or whatever, you might go to the land bank and say, I'd like to buy that field next to Kegs and the field next door to the one next to Kegs for 100 rubles. I don't have 100 rubles. I'll go to the land bank, I'll borrow the 100 rubles, and then I can grow food on those extra fields I've now got. And the idea is, with those extra fields, you then make more money, which you might then use to buy even more land, pay back the land bank, or whatever. So he was trying to create this kind of richer, more entrepreneurial type of peasant. And linked into this was he tried to reduce the power of the Mir. If you remember, the Mir were these local village elders, for a better phrase. They were quite old and they're quite, on a generality anyway, and they were quite stuck in the mud, Oh, we've always grown this type of crop, we can't possibly grow any other type of crop, what would Mother Russia say if we tried to grow carrots instead of parsnips, or whatever. And so he tried to reduce the power of the Mir to allow peasants to be more entrepreneurial, to experiment with new things. And again, the land bank was part of that as well, because obviously if you could borrow money to buy a bit of land, you might think, well, actually, on that third bit of land I bought, I'm going to experiment. I don't have to bother with the Mia telling me what I can and cannot grow. I've heard that maize is quite good, or I've heard that beans could be grown here, and they can experiment, and they might fail, okay, but also they might have a great success and grow an extra amount of carrots or whatever, which they've experimented with, and therefore that's another income stream for the peasants. So he was quite keen to reduce the Mia. One of the problems which they had regarding agriculture was a lot of peasants own bits of land in strips. So it's a bit like a peasant might own a little tiny field like where Keggs is located. The same peasant might own another field of a similar size, I don't know, the other side of town perhaps, the other side of the town centre, perhaps by the bus station for example. They might also own a field of a similar size, I don't know, in Bedworth or something like that. So they tend to own bits of land kind of all over the show, which isn't very efficient because obviously you've got your little tiny bit of land in Keggs, okay? You then got to move all your equipment, if you have any, or at least walk to the one at the bus station, do it there, and then go all the way to Bedworth. It takes a lot of time. So again, some of the idea of the land bank and trying to consolidate land was to try and have farmers to try and have land closer to where the existing fields were. Then they can make the fields bigger. Now, if you own two little fields, like say you owned the field where Keggs currently is, and then you bought the field where the police station is at the moment, the Justice Centre, well, you then got a bigger field, haven't you? You can take down the barrow in the middle and have a bigger field. So, again, that was all part of Stolypin's plans as well. The third thing he did, or fourth thing, I lost track how many numbers I'm up to now, this is something which Alexander II encouraged as well. It's also something which Khrushchev did in the 1960s, and this was to expand Russian agriculture into new areas. So, for example, Russia has Siberia, great big vast land. A lot of it is frozen, which isn't much use, but lots of it isn't. And so he was quite keen, Stolypin, to encourage peasants, especially with this population explosion, to move to areas like in Siberia and set up farms there. So to try and increase the amount of Russia itself, which was under agricultural production. Alexander II also does a bit of this with his Russification, going back, 50 years, in places like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. He tries to encourage peasants to go into these areas to exploit the land there. And then when we look at Khrushchev in the 1960s, he had a program called the Virgin Land Scheme, which again was to try and take Russians into places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and also into Siberia, again to encourage more areas to go under agricultural production. So there's a similarity here between Alex II, Stolypin, and Nikita Khrushchev. Which would be very nice, an essay, wouldn't it, about agriculture and similarities and stuff. Now, Stolypin argued that these reforms would probably take about 20 or 30 years to bear fruit, because obviously it takes time for peasants to consolidate land and experiment and blah 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 blah. He was also keen that it would probably take that time for these entrepreneurial peasants, to fully realise that this was thanks to the good government of the Tsar. So he argued it would take 20 or 30 years. Unfortunately for him, he was assassinated in 1911, and then the First World War kicks off in 1914. So by that date, the successes were quite limited. Around about 10% of farms had consolidated by this time, i.e. joined together to create these bigger fields and stuff like that. So the process was beginning to take place, but really by 1914, the beginning of the war, it hadn't really had time to bed in. It's going to take time, isn't it, for peasants to feel they could buy land and then to buy even more land, etc., etc. So whether it would have been successful in the long term is more debatable, and historians do argue about this. But by 1914, I think I would say successes perhaps were beginning, I would say. Then, of course, we had the First World War, which again you had to do for your homework. So this was all about, how the peasants benefited at first. There was more demand for food, but there were massive food shortages that took place during the war itself. And a lot of the issue was actually transport, getting the food from the farms to the army, getting the food from the farms to the big cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow and all these industrial centres. And the other problem was that a lot of peasant sons obviously went to fight in the war itself, and so there became some labour shortages as well in parts of Russia, which again made it more difficult to grow the amount of food. I suppose thirdly as well, you hadn't had time for Stolypin's reforms to bed in, which may have created an easy way to create more food more quickly. So during the war, food shortages were a major reason why Russia failed in the war. It's not the only one, there's lots of military failures as well, obviously, but there were lots of food shortages. And actually, it was food shortages in St. Petersburg in 1917 that basically triggers off the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution in 1917. And then Lenin, during 1917, he makes a promise about land. Land becomes a big thing of the communist kind of manifesto, for want of a better phrase, during 1914. Lenin himself was a bit more ambiguous towards the peasants because they were quite conservative with a small c. Industrial workers were his kind of people, much more militant and radical, whereas peasants, as we know from Alexander II, were a bit less kind of keen on these sorts of things. Right, speaking of Lenin, what I'd like to do is to find out about war communism and agriculture. Now, what war communism was that after the revolution, Russia kind of leaves the First World War. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed in 1918, and Russia finally leaves the war. However, the Bolsheviks under Lenin, they only really controlled like Moscow and Leningrad and a small amount of land. And so you have this civil war that took place. All those people who were pro-Tsar, aided by some foreign powers, including Britain, you had this vicious civil war that takes place for 2 or 3 years. Lenin is determined to win the civil war and for the Bolsheviks to crush all their enemies. And so they established a policy called War Communism. This is for agriculture and for industry. And what happens is basically every industry is nationalised, taken up by the state. The same happens to a number of farms as well. And there's massive demand. Everything is triggered towards this war. Everything that's produced in Russia must be towards the Bolsheviks and winning this war. So all Russian factories and stuff must produce bullets and guns and ammunition, whatever. All food grown by the peasants is seized, i.e. forcefully taken off the peasants and given to the Red Army in order to beat the opponents. And it's quite brutal. And many peasants, understandably you might argue, try to hoard food, and Lenin then, steps up further with the secret police. Many peasants are shot for believing they were hoarding food, and even when they weren't, you still believed they were. And what you then get was famine that took place. And there's even some reports of cannibalism that happened as well in Russia in this time. So a bit like Alexander III, Lenin also faces a big famine. And again, what I'd like to do for this, on Moodle there's a book by Figs called Lenin and Famine. It's just a page or two. I want you to read that about the famines under Lenin, and then just think about the comparisons between Lenin's famine and Alexander III's famine. Did the government treat the famine in the same way? Are there some similarities? Are there some differences? So there's 2 pages. There's War Communism you need to complete, and the famine, which isn't in the booklet. You need to do the bit of reading and perhaps draw a table up or something. There's a page then called NEP under Lenin. That is not National Car Park, that's NCP. NEP stands for New Economic Plan, and basically following the Civil War, which Lenin obviously wins, what he then does is that the economy basically is up a certain creek without a paddle. It's completely collapsed, and so he brings back market forces again. This is very controversial. A number of communists like Trotsky, for example, are dead against this, but he begins to introduce market forces again in order to revive the economy. So again, you need to read the bit in the book by Lynch, Lynch NEP I think it's called, okay, and complete the bits on agriculture on that. And then we come to Stalin. So Lenin dies in 1924. Stalin kind of emerges as the leader by the mid to late 1920s, and Stalin also has a very poor opinion of the peasants. He again distrusts them. He believes the peasants, are a very conservative force, not really Bolshevik. He also wants to build up Russia as a great power. And in order to do that, Russia needs to produce food. He's very keen that the peasants' role and job is to produce food in order to feed the industrialization of Russia. And so what Stalin does, he introduces a policy called collectivization. This is where the peasants are forced off their land, they're forced to collectivise, i.e. all land is owned by the state. Peasants, so say there's like 4 farms in Nuneaton, scattered around, they'd all basically be forced to close. It's set up like a super farm, like in Nuneaton town centre where all the different farmers would live, and then they'd all share out farming that land in great big fields and stuff like that. A real big radical change, collectivisation. There's a little YouTube video I want you to watch about collectivisation. It has some really negative consequences. Many peasants are very resistant to this, and you could argue, I suppose, are they being treated as serfs again? All their land, their private land which they've got, have been taken away and taken over by the state. Is that really different to serfdom in many respects? There are lots of controls put on them. It's worth just thinking about. Again, there's a famine takes place in the late 20s, early 30s, and again, there's the Figs book, Stalin and Famine, you need to have a look at, and then think about the similarities and differences between how Stalin deals with the famine compared to Alex III and Lenin. And something else which both Lenin and Stalin focused on are these richer peasants as well. They're particularly suspicious of these richer peasants, who Stalin calls the kulaks, and they are particularly targeted by Stalin and the secret police. So, it's a bit of a blood-stained kind of homework which I'd like to do. Be to complete then all that work on Lenin and War Communism regarding agriculture, Lenin and NEP regarding agriculture, read the Figs book Lenin and Famine, think about the similarities and differences between Lenin's famine and Alex III's, and then you need to look at Stalin, collectivisation, complete the booklet, and again look at his famine, and then there's a bit in the booklet we have to compare these famines with each other on similarities and differences. So if we get that done by the end of the week, I'm doing quite a few one-to-ones this week, so it might not be on Friday. I'll then do Khrushchev and agricultural changes, a bit of a summary, and then I've done the content for this academic year.